Welcome, everyone. As you join us, we want to invite you to share your name in the chat, and if you wish, a bit about why you chose to come here this evening for this event. And please keep yourself on mute. There will be a large number of folks joining us, which is wonderful, and it'll be tough to hear one another unless we maintain mute when we're not speaking. It's lovely to see everyone joining us. The invitation is for you to share your name in the chat and to please add a bit, if you would like, about why you have chosen to be here to share in this evening of learning and of justice work.
We have some media present from Jersey.com, Ricardo Colesar, and he needs to be let in.
I want to share again the instructions for closed captioning. Closed captioning is available with this Zoom. Oftentimes at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a box that says see and that if you click on that, closed captioning will be available throughout our event. If you have a hard time making that work, I welcome you to send a note to and this is in the chat, send a note to UUCM Tech Joe of why people have chosen to be here. And we're just about to begin. We're at 7:03. Let's begin.
Good evening and welcome to the Undoing Racism Team's virtual event, Reparations from Advocacy to Action. My name is Wendy McNeil, and I am a member of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Montclair, the institution hosting this evening's event. I am standing in the beautiful sanctuary of the U, the nickname for our congregation. It is located at 67 Church Street in Montclair. This building occupies the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and we acknowledge them as the original people of this land and their continued relationship with their territory. There have been many attempts to erase these great people from our history, but we are obligated to counter this erasure with our words and actions. In this space, on this sacred land, we gather to live, learn, and work as we bend the proverbial arc forever towards justice. And tonight, we hope to further bend that arc. New Jersey has a long and troubling history of ignoring racial inequities. We have segregated school districts, a large and almost insurmountable racially based wealth gap, and healthcare disparities that create worse outcomes for New Jerseyans of African descent than of other groups. We are here tonight to discuss the passage of Senate Bill 386, a bill that will establish a commission to study reparations. Passage of this bill will bring us closer to guaranteeing that all of New Jersey's residents will be able to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Reparations can move us closer to the promise that is America. We welcome former State Senator Loretta Weinberg, attorney Jean-Pierre Brutus, and author and scholar Dionne Ford in an important discussion on how the state of New Jersey plans to address the racial inequities through the establishment of a Commission on Reparations. It is typical for events honoring the Black community to begin with the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, written by the poet James Weldon Johnson. I would now like to introduce to you the choir from Arts High School in Newark, who will lead several choirs from throughout the state and country in this great song. And immediately following, our senior co-minister, Reverend Anya Samler-Michael, will greet you on behalf of the congregation. Thank you.
Let every voice sound, sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as a roar.
Thank you. That was incredibly beautiful and moving. Just incredible. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Reverend Anya Samler-Michael. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm one of the 2 senior co-ministers at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Montclair, and it is my honor to welcome you to this event. Will you please now join me in a space of prayer, meditation, and reflection as your spirit calls you. Yet we join together, each as we are called, all in this space of witness. Let us begin with gratitude that we are here, that we can be with one another, that we can gather together in this space, separate but together, that we have the space in our day to find one another here in this work and this witness for reparations. And we turn in our hearts from gratitude to lament because so much is broken in our world, in our hearts. Our hearts are aching. They are aching for the people of Ukraine. Our hearts are aching for the people in war-torn nations all over this globe, and we are aware that there are over 40 conflicts gripping this world in nations far, far from here. People are aching and hurting in the Ukraine, in Somalia, in nations far, far from here. And we lament that we live in a world that is so broken, and we see clearly that our lament does not only stretch to places far from here, but close at hand, because the work that we are about this evening begins with lament. Lament for 400 years of inequity, 400 years since slavery, 400 years of systemic injustice that have perpetuated divides, that have perpetuated a system and a people that needs repair so desperately. And so we move from lament to faith, because tonight I believe we must put our faith in this work of reparations, because it is not easy, and we have been asking for it. People have been asking for it. Ancestors have been asking for it for a long, long time. As long as there has been this harm, there have been those who are asking for this harm to end and for repair to come. And so we join our voices with them tonight, knowing that this work takes our faith, because we may be turned back and turned around, but we will keep moving forward because this is necessary work. And praise, let us turn to praise that we are here tonight together and we get to do this work together, that we get to see one another across this Zoom screen and know that we are not alone. And know that we are may it be so at a turning point where it is a possibility. May it be a possibility. And dear ones, as you are moved, may we say the words that grace our spirits. Amen. Ashe, blessed be, may it be so. Amen. And I want to turn now with some words of thanks. The town of Montclair very recently passed a resolution in favor of the Reparations Task Force for New Jersey. And so in this space that is still graced by prayer, I like to lift that up and say, look, the work is moving forward. And the town of Montclair, the town where this congregation is, has done some good work to that end. May it keep moving us forward. And in just a moment, we will hear from someone that I would like to introduce to you. There will be a video in between now and when we do get to meet Dionne Ford, but I'd like to introduce her to you now. Dionne Ford is our guide for this evening. She will walk us through and introduce our other speakers, and she is the author of the forthcoming memoir, Go Back and Get It, from Bold Type Books. She's also the co-editor of the anthology Slavery's Descendants, Shared Legacies of Race and Reconciliation from Rutgers University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Lit Hub, More, Rumpus, and Ebony, among other publications, and she's won awards from the National Association of Black Journalists and the Newswoman's Club of New York. In 2018, Dionne Ford received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Creative Writing. She holds an MFA in creative writing from New York University and a BA from Fordham University, where she teaches creative writing. And you know what else? She is also an incredible human being who, with her husband, Dennis Curdy, have two beautiful young girls and nurture a dedication to our congregation that manifests in worship and in justice leadership. And it is my great joy that Dionne is leading us tonight, because I've seen her lead people so many times before, and it is always closer to the right and light, closer to right and light. Dionne, it is great to have you with us. Before Dionne gets to share, we're going to have a video, but Dionne will be right back.
Thank you, Reverend Anya, to speak, and then the video will come to us. Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. And it is really my pleasure to be able to moderate this discussion tonight. I just want to take a moment to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Loretta Weinberg began her political career as a member of her town council in Teaneck, where she has lived for more than 50 years. In 1992, she became a member of the State Assembly, where she served until 2005, and that's when she joined the New Jersey State Senate. She was the majority leader in the New Jersey State Senate for more than 10 years and devoted much of her legislative career to issues around women and their families. She retired from the State Senate in January of this year after 17 years of service. Jean-Pierre Brutus is a senior counsel in the Economic Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Prior to joining the Institute, Jean-Pierre worked at Bronx Legal Services, where he represented indigent Bronx tenants facing eviction. Jean-Pierre is a graduate of Georgetown University with a major in sociology and a minor in African American studies. Through the JD PhD program at Northwestern University, Jean-Pierre is a graduate of the Northwestern Pitzer School of Law and earned his PhD in African American Studies from the Graduate School at Northwestern. Now we have a short 3-minute video on reparations that will just set the stage for tonight's discussion. So let's have a look. Thank you.
One of the key things that is at the heart of my thinking about the reasons why we have to have a reparations program, and it's a reparations program specifically for Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, is because there are 3 phases of American history that are associated with a range of deep atrocities that were directed against the Black community. And it's those atrocities that merit or demand restitution. The first phase is the obvious one, which is the period of enslavement, which ranged from 1776 to 1865. The second is the period that lasted for almost 100 years following the end of the Civil War of legal segregation in the United States. And then the third is the ongoing damages that have been inflicted on Black Americans in the period after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And here I would include mass incarceration. I would include police killings of unarmed Blacks, I would include employment discrimination, and I would include perhaps what's most dramatic from my standpoint as an economist, the enormous racial gulf in wealth between blacks and whites in the United States. So the U.S. government is the culpable entity, and the reason it's the culpable entity is because it established the legal and authoritative framework that made it possible for all of these atrocities to take place. If you look at the founding documents for the United States, the founding documents engrave in them the legality of slavery. If you look at the period of Jim Crow in the United States, there was no existing national legislation that was in place that would prevent the operation of acts of legal segregation both in the North and in the South. If you look at the current situation, there's no action that's being taken by the federal government to curb police violence that's directed against unarmed blacks. There's no steps that have been taken to compensate people who have lost family members as a consequence of that violence, nor have there been any steps taken to compensate people for being subjected to unjust or unwarranted incarceration. So it's actually there's a national responsibility that's in operation here, and the national responsibility has to be met by the federal government.
Okay, I think we're oriented. So now I'm happy to speak to Loretta Weinberg with a few questions. There we go. Okay, I was just waiting for her to be spotlighted. Hello, Senator. So hi, so good to be with you tonight. So why don't you start us off by just telling us what is in this bill?
Okay, before I do, if I may take a moment, those voices of those young people from coast to coast, I guess, in our country was really overwhelming. So I thank you, beside bringing the video to us, to have started us off with that inspiration for the future. And to the Unitarian congregations, thank you. I love the title of From Advocacy to Action, because hopefully what some of you will walk away with this evening is a dedication to the real action that it is going to take to get this bill passed. And I will fill you in on what the bill says. We have both a Senate version and an Assembly version, both of which have prime sponsors and many co-prime sponsors, and they are the same bill in both houses. And I'm just going to read one sentence right now from the actual bill. I'm concentrating on the Senate bill. I have a bias to that since that's where I retired from most recently. And there is one clause in this bill that says, while many northern states abolished slavery following the Civil War, New Jersey opposed the Emancipation Proclamation and was the last northern state to abolish slavery. So there it is. It is written into the bill, which if this bill or when this bill becomes law, that will be part of the law. And if there is no other reason than a moral endeavor for this state to make some amends for having been that state that I just read to you from the bill. The bill actually establishes a reparations task force. It lays out an 11-member task force who are appointed by a variety of people, by the governor himself, by the majority leaders in, by the Senate president and the Assembly Speaker in both houses, and by the majority and minority leaders, so that it would have some bipartisan flavor to it, and it calls for a pretty even split between the parties. So that's in and of itself is a kind of brief overview of how the Reparations Task Force is formed, and they will be asked, once this becomes law, to issue a report that not only addresses the reasons for reparations, but lays out a roadway for how we get there. One of the major requirements, and I think a particularly important one in the bill, is that they hold no less than 6 public hearings in various geographic areas of the state of New Jersey. I think that's so important because that will start the discussion on racism in our country, the outcome of racism right here in the state of New Jersey, and the reason why the Reparations Task Force will recommend that way. So I think that's a quick overview. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I want to thank Jean-Paul for Jean-Pierre for being part, I changed your name, I'm sorry, Jean-Pierre, for being part of this panel. I know you are a passionate advocate, and I know you will join in how we will move this audience to action. Thank you.
Before we go to Jean-Pierre, can I just ask, is there a time period in the bill that would say when the Reparations Task Force would need to come back and present their findings?
Yes, there is. I think there is a 6-month time period from the time that the bill actually takes effect. Now, the 6 public meetings, as I said, are in different parts of the state, and they definitely include the urban centers of the state of New Jersey. But let me just stop for a moment. I'm sure your audience generally knows how a bill becomes a law, those famous pamphlets that we hand out at schools. But in each house, this bill has been assigned to the state government committee in the Senate, and likewise to the Assembly State Government Committee. So it is the chairpersons of each of those committees who will have the ability to get the bill posted at a committee level. And the chairperson in the Senate, and I hope you all take some notes here, is Senator Jim Beach, who is from South Jersey, and the chairperson of the the Assembly State Government Committee is Assemblyman Brunelli. So those are the people that we would start lobbying in terms of moving the bill ahead.
Want to say those names again, just so everyone knows?
Yes, it's Senator Jim Beach, B-E-A-C-H, and I'm not sure of the spelling of the chairperson of the, let me see if I can find, Assemblyman Verrelli, V-E-R-R-E-L-L-I.
Thank you. And actually, while you're on that, I think people might want to know, as far as once the bill is passed, thinking positively, how or can people be involved, and who gets appointed to the task force? Is that something that the public has any say in?
Yes, people can be involved. Another place for lobbying and activism would be approaching those people who have the appointment responsibility, the governor himself, the Senate president, the Assembly speaker, the majority leaders in each house, and the minority leaders in each house. So it would be very helpful if there was some form of a coalition surrounding the recommendation, the nomination of some group of names, so that people are not necessarily competing against one another for the limited amount of members on the task force. But if there could be some coalition built around 3, 4, 5, whatever, appropriate nominees, that certainly should be done.
Okay. And before I let you go and move on to Jean-Pierre, you may notice that on Monday, the House passed legislation that would make lynching a federal crime. And I'm just wondering how at all this affects the New Jersey reparations bill, in the sense that, there's a legislative climate, and we often hear about a climate being hospitable or not hospitable to legislation. So I just wondered what your feeling is on that, and if you could speak to the climate in general here.
Well, I think the climate is not very positive right at the moment, and that is two main reasons. The first one is this last legislative, or this last gubernatorial election, where some people feel that Governor Murphy did not win by the numbers they anticipated. So from that comes a belief that something is going on in blue New Jersey that makes us not quite so blue. We lost seats in the Assembly. I think there was a net loss of 4 seats. When I say we, I'm talking about the Democratic majority. And in the Senate, I think there was a net loss of 2. So you add that to the fact that we're doing redistricting. We've just completed redistricting, which means the Senate is only in a 2-year legislative session. It is not the usual 4 years, because, well, really it's almost just a year and a half before we get into filing deadline for the primary elections and the next election of the entire legislature up from the new districts. So I think there's a little bit of a feeling of being less brave, less courageous in the kind of issues that they decide to attack. I think there's going to be a reticence to start discussing things that might be considered controversial. I don't agree with that idea. I think it's just the opposite. In fact, that if we have good discussions about issues like this, it will be helpful to keeping New Jersey blue. But that's my personal opinion. But I think I've given you a pretty realistic evaluation of the atmosphere that is going on in the legislature right now.
Thank you so much. Let's bring Jean-Pierre Brutus into this conversation. Thank you, Senator Weinberg.
Can we find out the numbers of the bills?
Do you want that now?
So I will actually just say that the bill, the correct title and a link to the bill and more descriptive information about the bill is actually in the chat. And we'll definitely post that again before we finish up tonight. Thank you. Hi, Jean-Pierre. Thank you so much. So yeah, you heard Senator Weinberg talking about the atmosphere that we're in. And so I think that's a good segue into your work. So why don't you talk about why the Institute is advocating for a reparations task force in New Jersey, which is a northern state.
Sure. So thank you. First, I just want to say a couple of thank yous. I want to say thank you to Wendy McNeil. I want to say thank you to you, Dionne. I want to say thank you to you, Reverend Anya. I want to say thank you to the Undoing Racism team. And I want to say thank you to your congregation, right? To the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Montclair. Thank you so much for having me on behalf of the Institute. Now, the question you asked is a great question. All right, it's an interesting question. I think in a lot of people's minds, we tend to have a kind of framework where there is the North and there is the South, right? And historically, the North is considered to be the land of freedom, the land without slavery, right? But as Senator Weinberger accurately pointed out in the legislation, New Jersey was once known as the slave state of the North, right? New Jersey was a slave colony, right? It was a slave society, right? Another way of putting that is slavery was mainstream in New Jersey. Now, Sandy Darity starts timeline in 1776, but New Jersey, right, and much of the US, as we call the US, right, began in the early 17th century, right? And New Jersey as a colony began in the early 17th century and incentivized slavery as an institution, distributing land. So, white settling powerful individuals would give an additional 60 acres of land. So there, right at the instant moment that New Jersey was created, you had this kind of bifurcation, right, between those who were subsidized and given land and provided a series of slave codes. Now, these slave codes were very harsh, right? They were intended to limit and undermine Black life, right? So things like imposing a curfew, right? Enslaved people could not congregate in groups of 5 or more after a certain time without permission of slave masters, right? Enslaved people could not own land. They could not vote, right? They were subject to capital punishment for minor and petty offenses, right? By the time you get to the 19th century, in 1830, right, New Jersey, as a slave state of the North, right, of the population of enslaved people in the North, 2/3 of those people resided in New Jersey, right? New Jersey, enslaved people in New Jersey would produce a grain surplus, and that grain surplus would go down to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean, right? There's a global network there, there's a connection, right? The rural areas of New Jersey relied heavily on enslaved people for production of food surpluses. Additionally, I think some of you may be familiar with the idea of the Dred Scott decision in 1857, in which the Supreme Court said, right, Justice Taney said that Black people have no rights by which a white man is bound to respect. Right? It was considered a harsh decision at the time, but that was the way in which the Supreme Court considered Black people's status in the United States. But years before, 36 years before, in 1821, the New Jersey Supreme Court found that the presumed status of enslaved people in New Jersey was that of a slave. So if you were a freed person in New Jersey, a freed Black person, you had to overcome this presumption of enslavement, which was hard to do. You have to provide a certain number of documents, and this was a hard threshold to overcome. Now, in 1850, the United States passed, the federal government passed a Fugitive Slave Act, meaning enslaved people in the South who self-emancipated, fled to the North, seeking freedom. If they arrived in New Jersey was the only state in the North to support the Fugitive Slave Act, meaning it allowed people in New Jersey to re-enslave, okay, those who had self-emancipated and were seeking freedom in New Jersey. Also, freed Black people in New Jersey were subject to being enslaved and sent down to the South. And New Jersey was not a sort of place of freedom for enslaved people. All right, it was very much a slave state. And as Senator Weinberger pointed out in the legislation, it was the last state in the North to abolish slavery. This was after the 13th Amendment had been ratified by the US Congress. All right, so New Jersey does not have a particularly good history with slavery, right? It was very much baked in to New Jersey society. Now, in 1865, you had the ending of slavery with the ending of the Civil War. You may think that enslaved people entered this period of freedom, right? But that was not the case, right? There was a brief moment of Reconstruction, as the eminent historian and thinker W.B. Du Bois pointed out in Black Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the slave went free. He stood briefly in the sun for a moment, and then he went back towards slavery. After Reconstruction, you have what essentially is the reorganization of white supremacy through various kinds of policies and programs and institutions. Things like sharecropping, right? An early form of sharecropping in New Jersey called cottaging. You had redlining, right? You even had Jim Crow in New Jersey, right? The literary scholar Sadia Hartman calls this period a burdened individuality, right? It's kind of vacillating between freedom and unfreedom, between citizen and subject, right? You have all these kinds of ways of imposing and undermining Black life. Black people were excluded from the benefits of FDR's New Deal legislation, right? The New Deal, baked into the New Deal legislation, because of Southern Democrats' desire to pass legislation there were elements, right? Like excluding agricultural workers, predominantly Black people, right? So you had at the federal level, excluding Black people from being supported and ways of supporting Black life. Additionally, World War II, all right? You had Black GIs who went to fight fascism abroad, and they called this what's called the double V, the double victory. The victory for fascism against fascism abroad, and the victory against Jim Crow, and essentially what is fascism in the US. They came back after the war thinking that they would benefit from things like the GI Bill, but they were excluded, right? Less than 100 people in New York and New Jersey, right? The GI Bill. This, provided a lot of GIs with a ticket to the middle class, to places like Levittown, right? You have Levittowns throughout the United States. And so you see over and over again, this simultaneous investment in white populations and sort of disinvestment and exclusion in Black populations. But even in the period up to 1965 afterwards, right, to the contemporary moment, you see a re-instantiation of a new kind of racial regime. You see things like mass incarceration, you see things like predatory lending, right? You see all this kind of underinvestment. You see a reformation of segregation in schools, right? And so I want you to think about the history of slavery in New Jersey, not just as the period from the early 17th century until 1865, but also the reformation, or some would call it slavery by another name, between 1865 and 1965, and then the contemporary moment. Some people call it the new Jim Crow. Some call it the new moment of predatory inclusion. All right, but I want you to think about these things as three kinds of racial regimes with different kinds of institutions that essentially are disinvesting in Black populations, limiting life chances for Black populations, while simultaneously subsidizing White populations. Right? And so this is why, and New Jersey is not unique. This is something that is part and parcel of the United States history. And there have been two brief moments in which the US has tried to address this: Reconstruction, which is a very brief period of time, and the Civil Rights era.
Thank you for that history. So talk to us about the campaign's name, the significance of it, and also just say the name of the bill in both Assembly and House, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I just want to start off with the number 300,000. $300,000. What is that number? That number is a difference between the median net wealth of a white family in New Jersey and the median net wealth of a Black family in Jersey. $322,500 for a white family in New Jersey, that's the median net wealth, and $17,700 for a Black family in Jersey. That's a massive gap, one of the largest in the country, right? And now this is a contemporary moment, this is contemporary New Jersey. And now if you want to know why we are here, you need to know your past, right? If you go to your doctor and you have a condition, the doctor diagnoses you, all right? And the doctor might misdiagnose you and give you certain kinds of medication to try to treat your underlying problem. The doctor may be treating your symptoms, right? You may be getting better, but you find you're continuously going back to the doctor because the doctor has misdiagnosed you. Doctor hasn't addressed the underlying condition, the disease that's affecting you. The United States is doing the same thing, right? Over and over again, the United States is trying to address a particular condition, this inequality, this massive inequality, right? This racial wealth gap and other racial disparities, but it's misdiagnosing the condition. What is saying the word reparations about? It's about diagnosing the condition properly. It's about saying reparations, we need to acknowledge, we need to address the harms of slavery, the specificity of slavery. If we want to cure the patient, we need to diagnose the situation accurately so we know what medication, what cure can happen, right? And so saying the word reparations, right, it might be contentious for some, it might be uncomfortable for some, but that's what the deal with the truth, right? Even in your own personal relationships, you may have a conflict with someone, you may have problems. How do you move forward? How is there healing in that relationship? You have to address, you have to have truth, you have to speak honestly, you have to be able to be vulnerable, right? The nation has never done that. New Jersey has never done that, right? And so saying the word reparations and having a reparations task force would allow people to have a democratic exchange, right? 6 public meetings in 6 cities throughout New Jersey to talk about the discrimination they face in their lives currently, to talk about, they may be descendants of enslaved people in New Jersey, right? This is this is what the possibility of having a reparations task force. And this is why we say the word reparations, because we want to talk about how slavery and the aftermath of slavery and contemporary inequality are connected and how we can address specifically the harms of slavery, right? We need to acknowledge that, we need to address that. Before we take those steps, you've got to adequately address the problem, right? And so that's why we have to say the word reparations, right? If we're gonna address this racial wealth gap, this massive racial wealth gap, it's accumulated over time from history, right? Things like benefiting from New Deal programs, like benefiting from the GI Bill, even benefiting from the 1862 Homestead Act, in which millions of acres of land were given to white families. But at the same time, the federal government would not consider giving 40 acres and a mule to recently enslaved people who are asking for that, right? So we need to think about the history to know where we're going, to know how we're going to move forward.
Sorry, I muted myself. And so that's a good segue into what steps your campaign hopes to take in order to bring this bill to passage. And we're already getting questions in the chat. So maybe after you answer that, we'll open it up for questions.
So the bill is A938 currently, and I would urge everyone listening to go to njisj.org/say the word. I'll say that once again, njisj.org/say the word. And there you can find information about contemporary inequalities. You can find more information about our multiracial, multi-faith coalition, right, which involves this congregation and many others who are involved in this campaign, this important work. And we made some important steps. We've taken in some important steps, right? We've got in Trenton, Newark, Montclair, right, city councils to pass resolutions in support of this task force. And we're continuing to push for other town councils and locales and city councils to pass resolutions in support of this bill. What we were trying to do during the month of February was to get Assembly Speaker Coughlin and Senate President Nick Scutari to post the bill for committee hearings, right? We wanted to move the bill along during Black History Month, right? It did not happen, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to stop trying, right? We're going to continue to push for that, to get movement on the bill, regardless of the political, environment, right? We're going to keep on pushing. That's our job. That's what we're doing, right? There's been a long, long history of people pushing for reparations, right? Starting with particularly with Black women, like Belinda Sutton, like Hallie House, right? This is a movement that's been long going and it will continue to be long going. John Conyers, in 1988 at the federal level, introduced HR 40. Just this past weekend, for the first time, right? The House now has enough votes to pass the bill, right? And so it's been a long history for the federal legislation. California has a reparations task force that's held a number of meetings, right? So there's no reason why New Jersey cannot do the same. Part of the job of people and people power is to get the politicians to realize what's going on, right? It's our job to put pressure on them. It's our job to move the ball down the field. It's our job to shift people's thinking, politics think, and get them on board on our side, right? And so what we're trying to do is show that there's support at the local level, right? Cities and councils and towns across New Jersey, and we're doing that by trying to get councils in support of this resolution, to show state legislators, hey, look, people support this bill. Also, what you can do individually is go to 400yearsnj.org, 400yearsnj.org, and you can contact directly Senate President Scutari, Assembly Speaker Coughlin. It's an action toolkit. You can email, you can tweet, and perhaps most importantly, you can call them and let them know, I would like this bill posted for a hearing. I want this bill posted for a hearing. Let's have this democratic process. Let's get this task force going. All right, task force will last 2 years. 1 year for an interim report, 2 years for a final report. Right, 11 members, thought leaders, who will hear people speak about, discrimination in their lives, historically about slavery in New Jersey, and about what can be done to address these issues.
Thank you. Okay, so I see one question in the chat that is from Helen. It says, I'd like to hear Jean-Pierre talk about the various forms that reparation might take.
I think that's a great question. I think this is something that the task force will take up. In terms of the ways in which the forms it could take, yes, I think the task force will consider direct financial compensation in the form of checks, but also I think it will take on the form of policies, of massive investments, right? It will think about things like baby bonds, perhaps, and anti-discrimination bills around housing appraisals, but it will look at what kind of investments can be made in Black communities. In his book, The Debt, Randall Robinson calls for a Marshall Plan for Black America. Now, New Jersey will do and the task force will do what it's going to do, but it will consider a number of possibilities, and that's why we need a task force, to consider what can reparations look like. It can look like a number of things, right? And that's why we need to have that conversation, to run the gamut of various policies that can address racial disparity in various institutions, right? Housing, and the political economy, and jobs, and health, and also criminal justice and democracy, right? It will address all those things, and it could take on different forms, right? Closing youth prisons could be a form of reparations, right? Thinking about improving the criminal justice system, improving public safety, right? So it could take on those forms.
Another question that I saw earlier from Nell was if six hearings is enough. Is 6 months enough? I'm sorry, for 6 hearings.
If I may give a correction, I said 6 months, but actually it's 1 year for the first report, within 12 months.
Okay. And so then those 6 hearings would be over that course of time, which is a lot longer. Okay, great. Thank you for that correction. I also have another question from Ricardo. are there towns or entities in New Jersey who've started their own program or version of reparations, like the Princeton Theological Seminary, which has devoted $27.6 million from endowment that has gone towards scholarship for students descended from slaves?
That's a great question. This is new to me. I did not know about Princeton Theological Seminary, but if there may be, perhaps I haven't heard of anything. The first truly, or you could say, local program has been Evanston, Illinois, that has designed a program of reparations that I am aware of, right? And next after that is California with a reparations task force, but Evanston is the first local town in the United States to design a reparations program for descendants of slavery in the United States. And it's particularly formulated around housing. They've set aside $10 million from the sales of marijuana or cannabis, and they've set aside $400,000 for housing in particular, $25,000 for each recipient to spend on things like housing repairs or closing costs. So that's the first, form of reparations at the local level. I think maybe universities, like Princeton in this case, or Georgetown, have designed programs for enrollment of people who were the direct descendants of enslaved people who were enslaved by those universities, right? But Evanston is the first town to do it.
And just my own follow-up on the Princeton question, I'm just curious how private attempts at reparation affect at all a public reparation that would be, more broad.
I would say that, it doesn't absolve the government and the state of responsibility, right? Slavery, Jim Crow, or state-sanctioned and supported institutions. And so the remedy and reparations has to also be state-sanctioned and government-supported. Essentially, reparations would have to be mainstream, right? And so having private action doesn't absolve or doesn't shift the responsibility that the government at the federal level, at the state level, and a local level has for addressing reparations.
Thank you. Yes, Loretta, please.
Yeah, I was interested to hear the list of localities that have passed resolutions in support. And I'm going to give a little practical political input here. Montclair, you said, passed the resolution. Montclair, which is the home to many opinion makers in the state of New Jersey, including our new acting attorney general, lives in Montclair. The mayor of Montclair, I believe, is the president or CEO of the New Jersey Education Association. The head of one of Governor Murphy's political action committees lives in Montclair, happens to be a freeholder director, Brendan Gill. So given that the Montclair Town Council passed this resolution, a reach out by the council, by advocates, by the congregation gathered here today to people like that to point out your own town passed this. These are the people that just came to mind that I know of who live in Montclair and are people who can actually help to get these bills the hearings that they deserve. So take advantage of all those opinion makers that live in this community.
Thank you, Senator Weinberg. I also saw several people ask this question, is there a public apology included in the bill?
So I was remiss. There isn't one included in the bill, but New Jersey did in 2009 formally apologize for slavery. I also will say that part of reparations, acknowledging the harm, will be thinking about how is slavery studied in New Jersey? Is the history of slavery in New Jersey taught in public schools? How is it taught? How is it memorialized? How is the public memory of slavery in New Jersey understood? What are the memorials, right? In her, inimitable work, beloved, the great Toni Morrison talked about how there wasn't even a bench by the side of the road for slavery, right? So how is it remembered in public life in New Jersey? How is slavery remembered? That's part of discussion around reparations, that kind of symbolic element, right? Yes, New Jersey has taken that first step in 2009 to publicly apologize and formally apologize for slavery, but now it has to take more steps, right? Material steps now. In addition to thinking about how is it taught, the education, but also the memory, right? How is it memorialized? What kind of monuments do we have? How is it thought about? How is it taught?
So yeah, definitely now there is a whole bench by the side of the road program that's global from her beautiful book. And there is also the Amistad Bill, which does say that the history of Black people in this country and in New Jersey is taught. But the question is, how is that implemented, and is it implemented? So yeah, I feel like we are at 8 o'clock. Let me just see if I can get another question in. So another question that I see being asked is, aside from the practical material side, what effect do we hope reparations will have? It's from Marcus.
I think, if the policies are commensurate with the harm, commensurate with the disparities, right? The hope is that, and the ideal is to close the racial wealth gap, right? To create and have the United States and New Jersey realize its goal of being a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, right? Both a political democracy and an economic democracy. That is the vision, the dream, the hope that would come from repairing the harms of slavery, right? It may take a long time. It may take, it may very well be beyond many of our lifetimes, but that is the idea, right? With the political will, the proper levels of investment and care, right? The idea is that it would end the kinds of inequalities that we come to take for granted, right? As being normal, as being part of the everyday backdrop of our experiences. No longer would that be the case, right? If done properly and correctly. That's the vision, right? That's the hope, to think of an alternative way of being, essentially, right? But that is the grand ideal. That is the end goal, in a sense. And I think we should always keep that, right? Because I think there might be attempts to kind of limit the possibilities of what reparations could be. But with people who were enslaved and thinking about their own freedom, right? This is the thing, kind of dreams they were having, the freedom dreams they were having. Take Robin Kelly, the historian's book.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. And we'll just end with Senator Weinberg. Go ahead. You are muted, Senator.
Sorry about that. As Jean-Pierre mentioned, the bill actually says that the task force should give recommendations which comport with national or international standards of remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state. So there is a very specific line in there that addresses the non-economic portions that we expect to hear from the task force.
Thank you, Senator, for pointing that out. Thank you both. I'm sorry, as your moderator, I let us go over time. So I will close on that. That's all the time we have.
Okay, so I'm going to close off.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks to Joseph Palka for managing our Q&A. Thank you very much. Some closing remarks from Wendy McNeil, our event coordinator.
Thank you, Dionne Ford, the Honorable Loretta Weinberg, and Jean-Pierre Brutus for participating in tonight's discussion. I also want to extend a note of gratitude to our partners, the ACLU, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, UU Faith Action New Jersey, the Youth Social Justice Coordinating Team, the People's Organization for Progress, and the Anti-Racist Alliance of New Jersey. And needless to say, this evening would not have happened without the youth tech team led by Deborah Ann Tripaldi, our minister, Reverend Scott Samler Michael, and Jerry Freed. And last but not least, I want to extend my undying gratitude to the Youth Undoing Racism Education team, of which I serve as the chair. Jane Gertner, Ellie Bagley, Helen Lipman, Jean Jackson, Sylvia Cowan, and Kathleen Shaughnessy. I'm going to end by saying a simple truth. We need to have reparations in New Jersey. Black residents who are descendants of slaves have suffered too many injustices, too many inequities for far too long. And it is ludicrous and quite frankly insensitive to say to a New Jerseyan of African descent that all will be well if you simply pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We are talking about generations of racial injustice. And the best way to make it right is through some form of reparations. So I'm asking you to please call your assembly person and your state senator and demand that the bill S386 be released from its committee and be placed on the calendar to be voted on. A bill to establish a commission on reparations must be passed immediately. Thank you for attending tonight's discussion, and Godspeed.
Thank you, everybody. Weinberg, Jean-Pierre, Dionne, thank you, Reverend Anya.
And if anyone wants to unmute and say something, we would love to hear your thanks, your gratitude, your cheers, your advocacy moving to action.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
It was wonderful. It was so enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It was
Dionne.
great.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this meaningful event.
Thank you.
Thank you, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, for
Yes.
helping get everybody together on this issue. Your
Absolutely.
pages are
Thank
so
you
easy to
much.
use.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cousin Wendy, for inviting me.
And thank you all for coming. This was wonderful to see such a good turnout.
Definitely.
Thank you for hosting such an
Can I just
important
Thank you.
conversation.
Can I make one more suggestion that you take the Montclair resolution and send it to a couple of other towns and ask them to consider it? My own community of Teaneck, for instance.
Good idea.
And West Orange, who's in? Who's in? Contact me. I will get you a letter to send to your mayor.
All right.
Nice. Okay.
I will get you a letter to send to your mayor. Anybody who can reach me at the UU.
Okay, thank you very much again. I look forward to hearing more from all of you as you do all the action that's necessary. So, and
Right.
thanks for everything you do, and Reverend Anya, thank you for your inspiration.
Yes, and thank you so much, Senator Weinberg.
Been so good being with everybody. If you're moved by this work, please be in touch with the New Jersey Institute. You'll get plugged in for exactly that work that the senator was just talking to us about. how do we get this to other towns, to other cities? We've got good work to do. It's been so good to be with you all. Go in peace, go in action, go in advocacy.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Anya. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, so much. And thank you, Senator Weinberg. It was a pleasure talking to you all.
Yes, it was a pleasure talking to you all as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so
Yep.
much.
Bye-bye.
Learned a lot. Thank you, everybody.